Hey there, TouchDesigner developers. DiLaura here with the Interactive and Immersive HQ. In this video, we're going to cover some basics of Perform mode. And specifically, we're going to look at how the use of Perform mode can take a project like this one, which is running at about half of its intended frame rate, and simply by implementing the use of Perform mode, can take us right back up to the intended 60 frames per second rate. So we're going to cover a number of things in this video, including how to set up the Perform window, some of the benefits of working with Perform mode, how to get out of the Perform window and return back to your network, and a couple of useful parameters to know in the window component, which is a key aspect of Perform mode. So to start off, let's talk about what Perform mode is. And why not dive straight into the TouchDesigner documentation to get a good definition. Perform mode is an optimized mode for live performance that only renders one specified window comp, which is one window that contains your video outputs and your optional control interface. In Perform mode, the network editing window is not open. You edit your networks in designer mode. The function key F1 and the escape key alternate between the modes. See edit window placement and /perform. We'll take a look at those last two things in just a second, but to kind of put that definition into practice, the typical mode as a beginner to TouchDesigner that you're probably used to working in is called the designer mode. And that is where we can work in the network editor to build our project. We can add and remove nodes, work with code, and manipulate various parameters for each and every operator. But we also have this performance optimized mode called Perform mode, which does away with all of that user interface of TouchDesigner. We no longer see the network editor, the parameter window, any of that sort of typical stuff that you're used to. And instead, we just see the final output of our project. Now, because TouchDesigner doesn't have to use the computer's resources to draw the user interface, the parameter window, and really all of these different nodes, all these viewers here are going to take up performance on the CPU and or the GPU. Because it doesn't have to spend those resources doing those things, it can dedicate all of that processing power just to making things run smoothly at our final output and typically give us a lot better performance. Whether we're developing a live performance project or an interactive installation, generally the final outcome of that project will be run in Perform mode. We do this along with some strategic development techniques to ensure that our project will perform at its best. And as we saw with this example, using Perform mode really makes a huge difference in a lot of cases to the project's actual frame rate. Now, again, I want to reiterate that we can enter Perform mode by hitting the F1 key on the keyboard, and we can exit Perform mode by hitting the escape key. Now that we've got the basics of Perform mode covered, let's go ahead and take a look at how we can set up our projects to use Perform mode. Fortunately for us, the default blank project that is created when you hit File New in the dropdown up here contains a pre-built Perform mode already included in the file. So meaning the various components and settings that need to be made in order for Perform mode to work are actually already implemented and very easy for us to utilize. So let's take a look at what that setup is, and then we'll add a node to our network to enable us to display this texture at our output. So to understand how this setup works, we need to head up a level in our project by hitting the U key on the keyboard. If you're new to TouchDesigner and you haven't seen this area of your project before, this is the root of your TouchDesigner project file structure. So if we look up top in our navigation bar, you'll notice that instead of being within project one, as we typically are when we're developing a project from a new file, when we go up a level, we're at now the root of this file structure, or this network structure, that is. And when we reach this point in our project, we'll notice that we have the project one container, which is where we build our networks typically. And then on the left, we have something called Perform. And if we click on that, that is actually a window comp. Now, if we head back to the documentation for a second, we'll remember that perform mode is going to specifically render one specified window comp. And so when we're working in this default setup, that is again created when we hit File New, the perform window comp that we see here in the root of our project is already set up to display in perform mode. Now, what exactly does this window comp do? And what are some of the settings that we can choose to modify for this operator? Well, I'm going to take us back to the documentation once again and head over to the window comp page. So the window component allows you to create and maintain a separate floating or fixed window displaying the contents of any panel or node viewer. Most frequently, you're setting up the window comp /perform, which is the one we're looking at right now, in the default TouchDesigner project. /perform is the default window for perform mode. In the parameter dialog of the window component, you adjust settings such as resolution, centering, and which monitors the window will get displayed on. Then, as we have already looked at, you can press F1 to enter perform mode and press escape to head back to designer mode. So this is the default window comp called perform that we have just been reading about. And as mentioned in that description, we've got a bunch of settings that allow us to control various aspects about the window. Now we're going to come back to these settings because right now this perform window is just going to be black. And so I think the first thing that we want to do is to actually be able to see our texture within the perform window. So let's head back for a second to project 1. Now, in that definition we just read, remember that we can use the perform window comp to showcase a panel or node viewer. When we're talking about a panel, that means if we head to the comp page, one of these components under this panels column. So those are a number of different operators that deal with things like creating user interfaces, for example. But we'll also notice that the container component is a part of that list, which just so happens to be what this project 1, the particular operator type that is of this project 1 component. So this is a container comp, meaning that we can show whatever contents we want from within this project 1 container as our perform mode's content. So when we're trying to choose what will display for this project 1's viewer, as you can see right now, nothing is displaying, but this is set up on the look page. And you'll see we have this setting here called a background top. So with the container comp, we can set up a specific top within the network that we want to show in the viewer and thus in perform mode. Now by default, project 1 is set up to look for, as we can see over here, an operator called out1 found within this particular component. So when we see the ./, that's telling us inside of this component, look for an operator called out1. We don't currently have an operator called out1 in project 1, and so we're just seeing a black texture for the viewer. Now, if we renamed, for example, null1 to out1, we could have that show as our background, but it's also very easy to just add an operator of the out type, which we can see here on the top page. We'll click that, add that to our network. We now have an operator called out1. And if we then head up a level, we'll see that that is being shown in our viewer, and at the same time is also showing over here in our perform window. So the tip here is that if you want to utilize this built-in setup for perform mode, whatever texture you want to showcase as the contents of your perform window, you can simply connect the texture operator that contains that texture to an out top called out1, and it will display for you in the background and thus in the perform window. I do want to point out that the background top operator is changeable. So you could change this parameter to point to a different operator of your choosing. Because this setting is added by default for us, it's just a handy way of using what's already there. But feel free to change it if you so choose. Now that we've covered getting a texture visible in our Project One container and thus in our Perform window, let's go back to the Perform window comp and talk about some of the settings. First of all, I want to illustrate that now that we have this texture appearing in both of our components, when we hit the F1 key and enter Perform mode, this is what we'll see. So we'll notice a couple of things. First is that we are showing in this Perform window a window that is smaller than the current screen size that I'm working with, which is just a simple 1080p monitor. And that is something that we have control over in the settings, which we'll take a look at. And along with that, we'll also notice that while this is a window, it also has the typical title bar added to this window as well, meaning we have the ability to close, maximize, and minimize, and we also have this little TouchDesigner icon, and we'll see to the right of the TouchDesigner icon the location of this particular window component. That is another element that we can choose to have display or not. And we'll take a look at that right now. So let's head back into our project. This is the window page of the window comp, which contains most of our important settings. And as we read about in the documentation, up at this in this top section, we can actually specify which display we want this window to be shown on. So right now it's set to display 0, and I want to emphasize this is a 0 index based parameter. So 0 actually means the first display that's connected to your computer. But for me, that is the display that we're currently looking at, and that's why this window shows up on this screen. But if you had multiple displays connected to the computer, I have 2 right now, I could set this to a higher value, like 1, and that would put it on the second monitor, which I could then show, but of course you can't see. So in the situation where you've got a project that maybe has multiple displays that you need to have a window span across, you can use this display to position the window starting on whichever display you choose. Now I'm going to set this back to 0. And then we've got these nice justify horizontal and vertical settings. And these allow us to choose, especially in this situation right now where our window size is smaller than the monitor, but even if it's larger, we can have these justification settings choose where that window will be shown. So for example, if I set this to left in the horizontal and top in vertical, and then hit F1, now we have the window appearing at the top left rather than in the center. So we can choose specifically where we want that window to be shown. The offset setting below that can be used to nudge the window's position a little bit. Rather than having it go all the way to the left or the right or the center, we can have it go to the left and then move a number of pixels in either direction. So that's a handy option to have there. Now I'm going to come down next to the opening size parameter, which is an important one to know about. This is what dictates the size of the window that we're going to be displaying. You'll notice that this has currently a setting that is automatically going to grab the size from the panel comp or top that this window comp is connected to. And so that actually is pointing us right back up to the top here to a parameter we haven't looked at yet called window operator. The window operator is essentially the panel component or node viewer, etc., that will be shown in our Perform window. So this is the texture that we're actually seeing here. And so in this default configuration, our window operator, of course, is Project One. Just to show you that this connection is important, if I were to remove the window operator, now we have nothing to display in our Perform mode, and this no longer functions correctly. So we need that window operator to have content to be able to show. And as I was mentioning, this is by default going to grab the Project One container. So back to our opening size parameter, this setting is telling us that it's going to pull the size for this window from the panel comp or top that's providing the texture. So that means whatever this container has been set up to output in terms of its size, that is going to dictate what the perform window size will be. And if we go back to the Project One container and click on the Layout tab, we'll actually notice that we have width and height parameters for this container. So we can adjust these and change this to maybe 1920 by 1080, for example, which has increased the size of that container in terms of its resolution. And that has the effect of increasing the size of our window. Now, I want to emphasize that even though we've set up this Project One container to output a 1920 by 1080 texture, it's not actually increasing the size of the texture that is found within it. So this is still a 1280 by 720 texture that's being generated on the inside of that component, and it's being scaled up to fill that space that has been created by the width and height parameters there. So the width and height parameters for this container comp are not necessarily telling you that you're generating a texture at this particular resolution, only that the way that it will be displayed or the size that it'll be displayed at is set via those parameters, and thus your perform window size is set via those parameters. So this is actually a great option for users who don't yet have a paid commercial license, as it allows you to still work within the 1280 by 1280 resolution limitation, but be able to display a texture across your entire display. So we've looked at now the scaling of that window, the resolution of the window. You'll also notice that even though this is the size of this display, we can still see the title bar and actually click on it and drag it and move this around. And that is not really ideal because, of course, we don't really want to see that title bar or have the ability to move this window around. So let's look at our next setting here, which is called borders. If I turn borders off and then re-enter perform mode, we'll see that that goes away. And now I can try to click as much as I want, and I will not be able to move this window around. Likewise, if my window was back at the 1280 by 720 scale, you'll notice that in this variation, we also still do not have that title bar any longer, and we can't move the window around. So that is how we can choose whether or not we want that to display. We have a couple of other useful settings here, including this cursor visible option, which allows you to choose if we're in perform mode. We can say cursor visible never, and you'll notice that the cursor disappears. Now I have this mouse highlighting software that is showing this little circle, but your typical mouse cursor that you would see in a normal situation disappears when it's over top of that window. So that's a great option to have. The default setting here is to only show the cursor when it's moving. And so that means when you're moving the mouse around, it will appear. And then after a period of time, after you've stopped moving the mouse, the cursor will disappear. So this is a handy setting if you need to be able to see where your mouse is. Maybe you've got multiple displays you're working with. That can be a handy setting and probably why it's set that way by default. The open and close page has a number of settings which allow you to open the window, close the window, set this particular window comp as your perform window, which it already is, so that doesn't really help us that much. There is one setting, however, that I want to point out that is used from time to time, which is this close on escape key option. Now, this is what allows us to hit the escape key when we're in perform mode and return to the designer mode of TouchDesigner. Now, you might wonder what happens when I turn this off. Am I unable to then exit perform mode? And you'll try hitting the escape key a bunch of times and notice you won't be able to return to the designer mode. Well, they've added a handy shortcut, Shift Escape, which allows you to still return to the TouchDesigner network while removing the ability to just use the escape key by itself. This is a useful setting to have as a way to kind of limit the potential for accidentally exiting perform mode. In something like an installation, for example, maybe where other people from time to time are interacting with the machine, adding this option can be useful to, again, limit accidental hitting of the escape key with the TouchDesigner window open and then returning to the network editor. So we've only covered some of the settings here. There are a bunch of other ones. Feel free to check out the documentation for the window comp for detailed descriptions of all of the rest of the parameters there. For this next example, we're going to walk through adding a window component of your own and then setting up the project to use that as the perform window. This will kind of bypass this default setup that is added to your project. And, in certain situations, maybe you would want to do that, but it's also just important to understand how this functionality works. So in this situation, I'm going to add a second window comp. I'll eventually delete the perform window, but I'm going to add a second one now for example. And we can do this on the OpCreate dialog comp page. In the other column at the bottom, you'll find the window component. And I'll just put this over here for now. The window component, when you first add it to your project, is going to tell you via this little warning flag that the window operator is missing or points to a blank base component. That means that, like that situation we looked at earlier, there currently basically is no content to display in this window, and we need to point our window comp to a panel component or node viewer that we want to show as our window. So to do that, I'm going to once again use project 1 as my window operator, and I can simply drag that operator onto the window operator parameter to make that error message go away, and we'll then see that texture appear within the viewer here. Now, if I were to enter perform mode, that small setting change that we've just done is not enough to actually use that window comp as our perform window. You'll notice that right now we're still using the previous perform window called /perform. To change which window comp in your project TouchDesigner is using as the perform window, we'll head to the dialogues dropdown and then window placement. This is a very useful set of settings to familiarize yourself with. It has a number of different things, including the section here that allows you to choose which window component is your perform window. And we'll look at some of the other ones in a second. But if we want to change which one of the window components in our project is the perform window, we'll simply find the operator in this list and click this little box on the left. So automatically, this is going to populate with any window components that are added anywhere in your project. And then simply by clicking that blank box on the far left, you can choose which one will be used as the perform window. Another useful setting we've got on this page is the ability to have our project start in perform mode, which can be really helpful, especially for things like installations, where you want the project to automatically boot up into this full screen perform mode so that no one has to go in and then manually kind of first see the TouchDesigner interface and then hit the F1 key to enter. Along with that, we have the option to set where the designer mode of TouchDesigner will be positioned. That is where this designer mode window will show. This can be especially helpful when you have multiple displays, maybe of different sizes. You can choose via these settings here where that designer window will show on your set of displays. So again, I've set my perform window, and now I can close this. And if I hit F1, we'll now see that this says /window1 instead of /perform. We're actually seeing the output of this window 1 component rather than the perform window comp. So I can actually delete that perform comp altogether and now move forward with this one here. Another option we have is to use a shortcut found in the window component parameters. On the open and close page, we have a button here that lets you set this as your perform window. So this is a shortcut, again, that allows you to bypass having to go to the window placement dialog and do it that way. You'll also notice there is an option here to open the window placement dialog, and that's another handy shortcut to have access to. Hey, it's Jack from the future. I realized after recording this that I've been showing you the experimental version of TouchDesigner, which has had some changes made to the position of certain parameters in the window component. So if you're running an official version of TouchDesigner in 2025. I'm currently running version 2023.12.370, and you may have noticed that your your window comp parameters look a little bit different than what you've just seen in the video. That's probably the reason. So the main difference here is that the open and close settings and the set as perform window option are all found in this official release at the bottom of the window page, rather than on a separate page as in the experimental called open and close. So this is how things have been in TouchDesigner for a while now. Those changes in the experimental may make their way into the official release at some point in the future, in which case you can kind of ignore this whole section. But the point I wanted to make is that if you're looking at your window comp and sort of scratching your head as to why you don't have a second page, or really a fourth page of parameters here, but an additional page of parameters called open and close, or can't find those open, close, and set as perform window settings, they are likely found at the bottom of this window tab. With that, we're going to close out the video. I hope this has been an informative look at the perform mode in TouchDesigner, a really useful and honestly necessary component of the program to understand and be able to utilize in projects of your own. So with that, thanks so much for watching. Looking forward to seeing you in the next video.
Hey folks, thanks for watching. If you like our YouTube content, I highly recommend you check out the Interactive and Immersive HQ Pro. The HQ Pro is the only comprehensive educational resource and community for immersive design, TouchDesigner, and creative tech pros. In the HQ Pro trainings, we cover almost any topic you can think of, and we go way more in depth than we do in our YouTube tutorials. We have a private group where Matthew Reagan, myself, and our other industry veteran and pioneer teachers answer your questions every single day. If that sounds cool, click the link in the description to learn more. And if you enjoyed this video, hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe for more free TouchDesigner and immersive content.